Monsters occupy this really interesting place, and that monsters are always these kind of creatures that trouble our categorization systems, right? So we're never sure if they're alive or are they dead? Are they human or are they not human? How do they work? So they exist in these kind of in-between spaces that are hard for us to categorize. Are they evil? Are they not evil? And that's what makes them kind of fascinating for us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Vandal Theory, a podcast about science and research at University of Idaho. Our podcast is a great way to discover the exciting research that has earned U of I the Carnegie ranking of R1, a designation for research excellence that only 4% of all U.S. higher education institutions attain, and the only Idaho university to do so. My name is Lee Cooper, and I'm the science writer and editor here at University of Idaho, and I am joined by Danae. Hi, Danae.
Hi, Lee. I'm Danae Lenz. I'm the External Communications Coordinator at U of I.
So today we are going to talk about horror movies. And to start, let's ask the really basic question. What's your favorite horror movie?
This is probably a very unpopular take, but honestly, my favorite horror movie is Nosferatu. I have seen the original, and I think that's part of the reason why I love the most recent one. But yes, the one that came out in 2024 is probably my favorite horror movie. It is so weird. It's so beautifully shot, and I am a sucker for gothic horror stories. They're just on a different level.
Everyone's allowed to like what they like. I would go with the fact that, I did not like that movie. Although I do agree it was beautifully shot. It was absolutely gorgeous to watch. Horror is never my go-to, but I have a great appreciation for some of them. Especially some of the older ones where so many of the tropes were put together. It's interesting to watch those and be like, oh yeah, I've seen that in like a billion things now. If I have to go for horror, I really go for the more campier, I don't even know if you could put them in the horror category, like Brendan Fraser's The Mummy and Jaws. Like, I find those so much more entertaining than maybe some of the classic Chainsaw Massacre sorts of things and like the really gross stuff. I find it a little hard to swallow.
No, I agree. I don't like gore either. I'm also not a horror movie aficionado, and I don't really like being scared. If I had to pick a second one, my other favorite is Midsummer because it's horrifying, but it takes place during the daylight, and everything is less scary when the sun is shining.
That's one of the ones that's definitely in my appreciation category. Like, that is just, again, beautifully shot. But I think about that movie way too often. Like, it wormed its way into my brain, and that is so creepy. That is like one of the creepier movies I've ever seen. So today we're going to meet Russ Meeuf, a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Media at University of Idaho, and a scholar who knows monsters better than most. We'll talk about what makes a monster truly terrifying. What do these creatures reveal about our deepest fears, our society, and ourselves? And why do monsters evolve as our cultural anxieties change? Russ will guide us through the haunted corridors of horror cinema, showing how monsters are more than just nightmares. They're mirrors. So grab your flashlight, lock the doors, and tune in to our Halloween episode, if you dare. You ready?
You just have to promise me if there's any jump scares.
Okay. Well, Russ, welcome to the podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Excited to talk about horror movies.
Excellent. So before we dive in, can you introduce yourself? Give us a little bit of a background.
Yeah, so my name is Russ Meeuf, and I am a professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Media, and I also direct our film and television program here at U of I, which trains aspiring filmmakers and storytellers. And then part of my job is doing research on media and film culture, and so I write about celebrity culture, genre films, and most recently about horror films.
Which is extremely pertinent because this podcast is going to go out the week of Halloween. So I have found so many people either really like horror or don't like horror. What intrigued you about it? What drew you into this genre of film?
Yeah, horror can be very polarizing in terms of audience response in that it's a really unique genre. Most of the time when we're talking about genres and films, we're talking about why people like them. We're talking about pleasure. We're talking about like, oh, this feels good to watch this, or this feels satisfying to get this narrative conclusion. Whereas one of our benchmarks for horror is Does it terrify you? How does it like make you kind of feel creepy and crawly and gross?
Was I
How,
uncomfortable?
yeah, it makes you uncomfortable. So why is it that we spend so much time and energy and money going and being put in these uncomfortable positions? So it's a really fascinating genre from that part because it's in many ways about fear, discomfort, the uncanny, about like what all the things that we find disturbing in our world. And so it becomes a really, really great place to start thinking about like why are we afraid of this? What are our fears? What does it tell us about us or our culture or our society? So yeah, so it's a strange phenomenon that we go ritualistically out seeking these like experiences to make us uncomfortable.
Obviously, there's tons of types of horror movies, and we could spend hours and hours and an entire course on them, in fact. So, for today, since we only have 20 minutes, let's talk about monsters. Let's focus on what makes a good movie monster. So, in your opinion, what does that take? What are the ABCs of an excellent monster movie?
Yeah, so monsters are such a fascinating place to explore this, right? There's these creations of screenwriters and the stories, and obviously these are monsters exist well beyond movies, right? So
Sure.
we talk about monster movies, but monster stories are kind of one of the most persistent genres of human storytelling.
What else are you going to tell around a campfire?
Exactly, exactly. And so there's a lot of really interesting research and scholarship on thinking about like, okay, why is it that we tell these types of monster stories over and over again? And what is it that kind of unifies these monsters, that bring these monsters together? And one of the readings that I use in my class on horror films is by Jeffrey Jerome Cohen, and it's called Monster Theory, 7 Theses. And it's all about this question of like, what is a monster? And for Cohen, monsters occupy this really interesting place, and that monsters are always these kind of creatures that trouble our categorization systems, right? So we're never sure if they're alive or are they dead? Are they human or are they not human? How do they work? So they exist in these kind of in-between spaces that are hard for us to categorize. Are they evil? Are they not evil? And that's what makes them kind of fascinating for us. And in that in between space, they also then are about difference, right? What are the things in our culture that we kind of want to repress, the things that we make monstrous? And so they often symbolize things like, national identity, what makes up a community stick together and what's not part of the community, who's an insider, who's an outsider.
Okay.
And they explore these kind of like all these questions around like, how we categorize things, who belongs in our community, who doesn't belong in our community. And in many ways, they tell us kind of stories about like who we are by who we think we're not, right? Because monsters are that which we reject from our own communities and from our own cultures.
You're saying all this, and I'm seeing all these examples go through. I mean, first off, you were talking about how they have often kind of a dual: are they living? Are they dead? Are they A or are they B? And I mean, all the classics fit there: vampires, mummies, living, dead. I mean, there's so many of those that kind of fit that kind of dual categories.
Yeah.
Those are obviously some classic monsters. Are there like some examples for that kind of dual facade that maybe is beyond the classic monster?
Well, so in my class, when we're talking about kind of this definition of what a monster is, we usually go to Freddy Krueger,
Okay.
who's not only kind of he's a classic monster by now, but not necessarily a classic monster by folkloric standards, right? You think
Sure.
about like mummies and vampires and zombies; they have these kind of longer traditions. Freddy Krueger is kind of an invention of a particular moment, but he's a great monster, right? And in many ways, when we think about the Nightmare on Elm Street series, we're thinking about Freddy himself, right? Even though he's the villain, he's the star of these shows. And yeah, he works so well as a monster because is he alive? Maybe he was at one point, but now he only exists in a dream world. Is he physical or is he not physical? Can he come into our world? Can he not come into our world? Is he human anymore? Right? So he's deeply disfigured and burned
Mhm.
and scarred. And so he has like, you can tell that he was once human, but maybe now he's not human. And then he preys upon typically teenagers in these kind of vulnerable moments of their own kind of like growing up and like becoming adults. And then so like he kind of gets in the middle of all of these different kind of categorizations and then kind of polices those borders, right? What kind of teenagers are going to be targeted? Are they bad teenagers? Are they good teenagers? And he's a kind of an outlier of our culture, but he's also somebody who helps kind of moderate or police like, oh, this is behavior that's going to get you in trouble with Freddy Krueger, which is another one of the functions of monsters, right? To kind of act as warnings and to say like, oh, this is something, don't do this or else this monster is going to get you.
Very much the if you don't behave monster of
Yeah.
tons of folklore.
Yeah, right. And I'm a parent, and you get this, right? Like you need something to keep your kids in line to help them learn the community values. And sometimes these stories are a way of us kind of creating monsters that help us say, okay, this is behavior that is acceptable and this is unacceptable. And how do you scare people into the unacceptable behavior? Well, yeah, it's a monster. It's going to show up. It's going to get you. I promise. Yeah.
Going to kind of the second part you were talking about, the in-group, out-group mentality.
Mm-hmm.
What's maybe an example, like a classic example, and then maybe a newer example of that?
I mean, I think a classic example of kind of like in-group, out-group might be something like Frankenstein's monster, who is both a monster that is very clearly an other, right? Who's kind of ostracized from the community, who is somebody who's like, oh, this monster is terrorizing us. This is a monster who like wants to belong but can't belong, and is right. And that's what makes him such a compelling monster, right? Is that
it makes him a tragic monster.
Yeah, we empathize
almost
with him because he's so so clearly wants to belong but cannot belong, and embodies all of these ideas of the culture because he exists in those boundaries, right? Is he alive? Maybe, right? And so he gets kind of pushed out. And there's a lot of really great scholarship exploring how, especially the popularity of Frankenstein's monster in the 1930s, is very much deeply embedded in kind of changing gender roles, race, and ethnicity, and thinking about who belongs and who doesn't belong. He's literally a monster with a different color skin as everybody else, who has to be pushed out and ostracized in order for the community to come together and become unified. And so I think that's a good classic example of like a monster that helps negotiate, sometimes in complicated ways, ideas of who's in and who's outside of communities. You wanted a contemporary example.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. It's hard because in the last 10 years, we've been very much in like a nostalgic phase too. So
Also true.
Yeah. So like,
Gotta Stranger Things it up.
yeah, right. So we could use Stranger Things. Vecna is a great monster for that as well, right? In terms of thinking about like insider, outsider. I mean, I don't want to. Can I give away spoilers for people who still haven't gotten caught up and getting ready for season 5?
We're doing all spoilers. Just stop listening now and go watch all the monster movies.
But in Stranger Things, Vecna is again, right, somebody who defies different types of boundaries. He exists in the upside down, but can't quite come into our world, but wants to come into our world. He is an outsider who was ostracized and studied and felt persecuted, who then gets banished to this other world and is desperately trying to claw his way back in to wreak havoc on the world that rejected him. And then he has a foil in Eleven, who is in a very similar position, but
chose a different path.
She's accepted into the world. She isn't resentful against the world that's kind of done so much harm to her. So very much about those kind of insider-outsider dynamics, which you can read in a lot of different contexts in thinking about national identity, thinking about race and ethnicity, gender, sexuality, all that kind of stuff.
How does a writer or director tell a good monster story? What are the things that they have to kind of decide?
Yeah, so the monster movie in and of itself is kind of its own little genre, right? That it has a set of kind of expectations and assumptions, and it will vary from monster to monster, right? So like a vampire movie has a different kind of internal logic than a zombie movie, than a haunted house movie with a ghost in it. But for the most part, monster movies all kind of are organized around this revelation of a monster, and then also the kind of like the disbelief of the monster. A lot of the monster movie is about, certain individuals get advanced news of the monster's arrival, and then have to try to convince the rest of the community that the monster is coming, and nobody believes them, right? And so a lot of it's about like the monster, what they represent, the threat that they pose to the community, but it's also about, can our community adapt to like, oh, we believe that this is a real thing. We're not just going to dismiss this out of hand, right? You're not just a crank. So if you think about Jaws, like there's all of these red flags and warnings and right, but there's always somebody who's saying like, no, like the monster is coming. You guys need to listen to me, and nobody listens to them until it's too late. And so it's also about belief and disbelief, about people willing to reject kind of cold rationality and acknowledge that the world is maybe more complicated than they think it is. And so there's usually kind of that structure. And then, of course, it yields a confrontation with the monster, where you have to try to figure out like what makes the monster tick, how do you defeat it? And then importantly, and this goes back to those 7 monster theses, you could only kind of defeat a monster. Cohen talks about how monsters always come back. you can maybe defeat a monster in a particular movie, but it always is resurrecting, always coming back. And part of that's it's that liminal nature of it. Like, how do you kill something is it alive? Is it not alive? Is it supernatural? Is it not supernatural? You can provide like a temporary kind of, well, we've defeated the monster in this instant, but you know the monster's always coming back. You know, they ostensibly blow up the shark in Jaws, but like we know Jaws 2 is coming, right? We know that there's going to be more and more of this monster coming back because, again, the monster is our own creation. And so it's something that is always persistently nagging us.
Well, that makes sense why, of all of the genres out there, horror, that's the one that's like, oh yeah, we're going to make 5 of these.
Yeah, and obviously part of that's like the economics of Hollywood, right? When
Sure.
you establish like a marketable IP, you milk the marketable IP. But it's also, yeah, about the nature of monsters and about, you know, when you create a compelling monster, something that's successful, something that really resonates with an audience, it's because it really taps into something in the culture, to things that people fear, things that people are grappling with. And so, like, you can tell a Freddy Krueger story that, you know, originally comes out in the early 1980s that's about, you know, a lot of things, right? It's about, like, teenage sexuality and parents and divorce and sexual abuse and all these kinds of things. Those don't go away just because the movie ends. And so, of course, Freddy's coming back. He's going to always be coming back. So.
How does it work in to the idea that, yeah, I mean, if you read about Jaws and the making of Jaws, and do you show Jaws? When do you show the shark?
Yeah.
And so how does that work into what you were just talking about?
Yeah, so typically, again, with this kind of structure of this kind of slow revelation where there's like maybe a few people who kind of see the advanced warnings, there's usually kind of a slower kind of revelation of the monster. Partly because that's about like building tension, and you often are kind of leaving the audience in this little bit of nebulous space. You know, when you sign up for a monster movie, you know there's going to be a monster, but part of the fun tension is like, what kind of a monster is it going to be? How is it going to reveal itself? And so not all monster movies do this.
Sure.
So the host, the South Korean monster movie, the host very famously just like in the opening scenes, just like, oh, there's the monster. He's here and he's eating people, and then you have to deal with it. But it's much more common for it to be this kind of like teasing the audience a little bit. And again, part of that's about the nebulousness of the monster. If you know the monster just walks in the door and like sits on the couch and is like, "Hey, I'm here," it's kind of it allows us to kind of poke and prod it a little bit more and kind of like think about like what it is. Whereas like the slow reveal allows us to wallow in that sense of in betweenness with it and build tension for its big reveal. And then of course you get the very satisfying nobody believes them, and then suddenly, oh, here is the monster in all its
no!
glory. It's here, it's upon us, and everything. So yeah.
All right. We've been talking about how these fit in our culture and all of that. What does it tell us about who we are as the viewer? What does the monster tell us about what do we bring to the table in a monster movie?
Yeah, and I think in most monster movies, we're bringing a set of anxieties and fears, right, that we want to see played out in kind of an exaggerated form. So most horror movies and monster movies are very much interested in kind of a particular historical moment and kind of the anxieties that people are feeling in that moment. And oftentimes we want to go and see the things that are in our world replayed out on the screen. And so there's a lot of really interesting scholarship looking at how different types of historical moments and different cultural fears and different kind of audience expectations will yield different types of stories. So this isn't a monster movie, but you know, after 9/11, there was a pretty significant uptick in very kind of like graphic, violent movies that were about torture, about violence, about people doing inhumane things to other people. So in the midst of the war on terror, we're using horror to kind of talk about like the ethics of violence and the ethics of doing inhumane things to other people. Or something I write about in my book on horror films, in the wake of the housing crisis, we suddenly see all these haunted house films, and we see lots of like ghosts and hauntings. So at this moment in which, particularly for white middle class families, the idea of home ownership becomes something that's more fraught, that's not this kind of lifeline to economic stability. Suddenly we're telling story after story after story about typically white homeowners moving into houses that they think are going to save them and their families, but are actually kind of dragging them down, both financially and personally. So there can sometimes be a real kind of direct relationship between kind of the fears that a culture is working through at the time and the kinds of horror and monsters that are engaging with those. And so we can see like this really interesting dynamic, right? You know, post-Vietnam, we see, a set of different types of horror. And so a lot of times horror is, very much interested in like, what are we going through as a culture and as individuals in this moment? And how do we play out those fears in a kind of exaggerated, monstrous form? Which is what what monsters are for, is to find the things that we're afraid of and kind of exaggerate them for us.
Whether it's horror or even fantasy, sci-fi,
Mm.
all of those, it's a way to talk about real issues, but one step away. So it's
Yeah.
almost easier to discuss the things because if you talk about literally what's happening, it's almost too personal.
Yeah, right. A kind of like a displacement, right? That we have this like big anxiety, and yeah, you can't look at it directly, so you kind of look askance at it, right? So we don't really want to talk about this X, Y, and Z, but we'll tell a story that kind of like hints at that and kind of exaggerates it in particular ways. Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the key functions that horror does for us in our culture.
So does that mean that our monsters evolve over time because we need them to fulfill different roles for us?
Yeah, absolutely. So monsters are both static and dynamic, right? In that we like the continuity of a monster over time, but we also like that it changes and adapts in different moments. And a great example of this would be something like the zombie, which is a kind of an interesting Americanized adaptation of this Haitian folklore belief that absolutely modifies over time. So the zombie mythology originally comes from Haiti, but the way that we think about zombies are really kind of come from this moment in the late 1920s and 1930s when the U.S. is occupying Haiti at the time, and they become fascinated with kind of voodoo and Haitian folklore and
Hmm.
ritual. And we start telling these very American stories that modify that idea of the zombie. But in the 1930s, that idea is very much it's about some of those things that we would recognize around kind of like a loss of autonomy and a loss of identity and being subsumed by this overwhelming desire. But for the most part, it's the 1930s zombies movies are about people who like entrance other people and make them do their bidding, right? They're kind of like they
Oh,
become slaves to,
mind controlled.
yeah, mind control kind of stuff, which is very key to the original zombie mythology, right? Which is from Haiti, which was the first Black republic in the New World after it
Hmm.
overthrew this horrific slave-based regime. The original idea of the zombie is this idea in Haitian folklore is about that sense of becoming a slave to someone else's will and like the horrors of that. But in the US context, it becomes very much more about these kind of foreign outside threats that kind of weasel their way into the US and then like zombify people and make them do their master's bidding. So if you think about like White Zombie from the early 1930s is like very much a zombie film, but if you watch it today, you wouldn't recognize it. That kind of modifies and changes. And then when we get to like 1968, Romero takes that idea in Night of the Living Dead, but transforms it completely. Instead of this idea that it's okay, there's a zombie, suddenly it's a mass of people. So at this moment of massive cultural upheaval, when we're thinking about autonomy, conformity, violence, who's in charge, we get this kind of modification of the zombie to make it something that's more about how do individuals stand up against these masses of zombies who are coming after them. And the zombies aren't beholden to a master, but are just simply coming after you because they have this insatiable need to eat you or maybe eat your brains, depending on which zombie mythology you're working in. For Romero and some of kind of the people who follow Romero in the 60s and 70s, then zombies become very much this way of kind of critiquing U.S. culture. I think critiquing cultures of conformity, critiquing humanity. And most of these zombie films, really, there's zombies there, but the bad guys are other people who are struggling to deal with how to like subsist in this in a zombie apocalypse and how to get
Okay.
along with one another, how to share resources, how to build a new world while the zombies are out there. But then, of course, zombies become campier and funnier. We're kind of in an era of zombie comedies and even zombie romances today,
So true.
where again that idea of like insideness and otherness is now coming back to use zombies as more of a metaphor for kind of racial and ethnic others. So we can see that it's still a zombie, whether we're talking about the 1930s or today. But in these different moments, it comes to mean something different to us and can help us explore different types of anxieties that we're dealing with at that time.
Yeah, I mean, some of the newest ones, what is it? Warm Bodies and Lisa Frankenstein and stuff. I mean, they're very much comedies and very much yes, making friends of the zombie.
Yeah, make friends with the zombie, fall in love with the zombie, and they're still circling around a similar kind of idea around autonomy and
Mhm.
individuality. This is something that's present in a lot of zombie narratives. This idea is, can zombies move beyond their programming? Can they like exert some sort of individuality? So, like in the 80s, there's different zombie movies that explore the idea of like, okay, can a zombie change? Can the zombie think? And like something like Warm Bodies is an exploration of that, right? That idea of like, oh, if even if you're programmed in a particular way, even if you're kind of subsumed into this identity, can you still exert your own kind of individuality and fall in love and do something different? So, still circling around the same ideas, but in very different ways and in different contexts.
Cool. Russ, thank you so much for coming today. Any last thoughts you want to leave with the audience?
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to always talk about horror movies and monster movies. I would just encourage everybody to go out there and pay some money to watch a movie in a theater and support filmmakers around the world, and particularly support your independent movie theaters. We're really lucky here in the state of Idaho to have a number of really awesome independent movie theaters that bring us great horror films and all sorts of different types of films, whether we're talking the Kenworthy here in Moscow, the Canada Theater in Sandpoint, the Flicks down in Boise. Go out there, spend some money, watch some movies, and have fun.
All right. Thanks a bunch, Russ.
Thank you.
So no jump scares.
No, thank goodness.
So what'd you think?
I really, really loved this interview. Every single aspect of it was really cool. The one thing that really stood out to me was he was talking about how horror often reflects what is going on in society. And when he said that haunted house movies became popular after the 2008 financial crisis, when, like, in real life, everyone's homes were basically monsters.
Right.
You know, they were ruining people's lives. And so to see that reflected in film, I thought that was so interesting. And in some ways it's kind of obvious, but like I had never thought about that before, and I was like, dang, Russ, you kind of blew my mind with that one.
I really liked, and I mean, it is so simple, the idea that these monsters have a kind of duality to them. Are they alive? Are they dead? Are they human? Are they not human? Are they intelligent? Are they not intelligent? I find that so interesting from a kind of psychological point of view of whether we see ourselves in them, as in like Frankenstein, do we see ourselves being not having a place in society, especially, you know, growing up as a teenager, you might feel like, oh my gosh, I don't fit in. Even as an adult, that happens. So seeing yourself in the monster, or what makes it so scary that you don't know whether it's alive or dead, or whether it's intelligent or not. Like Jaws. Is it just a shark? Is it just an animal? Or does it have some sort of greater intelligence and greater drive than just, I need my 3:00 snack? Why is that such a compelling, scary thing to not know? Yeah, I just find that idea really interesting.
Yeah, I do think that bit's interesting, because also, what's scarier? Is it scarier if it's just a shark that is just nuts? Or is it scarier if it's something else? Both of those are very scary, and I do like that in between of, since you don't know, it's scary both ways, you know?
I hate thinking about that. No, I'm not going to sleep tonight. Thanks a bunch, Danae.
You are so welcome.
All right, thank you for listening to The Vandal Theory. You can visit our website, uidaho.edu/Vandal Theory, to learn more about our research. Email us at vandaltheory@uidaho.edu with questions, and make sure that you get out there and check us out on your favorite podcasting platforms where you can rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. My name is Lee Cooper.
And I'm Danae Lenz.
Happy Halloween, everyone.